So PC gaming is often considered to be quite expensive to get into and also very intimidating to build. But to get a decent system up and running doesn't need to be expensive or stressful. The one that we're building today definitely reflects that. It comes in around $550, uses a mix of past generation hardware, and is super straightforward to put together. And as a bit of a plot twist, this one is actually for a friend who's looking to get into PC gaming, and should be more than enough for the types of games that he's looking to play. So let's have a look at the hardware, put it all together, and test it out and see how it runs. So driving the initiation for this build was a friend who didn't have much to spend on a PC. His budget was around $200 US, and after a bit of time going back and forth with him showing me some pretty sketchy Craigslist ads, I just told him, look, I've got some spare parts laying around that could go to you. Why don't I order the remaining parts that I don't have, and you could just pay me the amount of your budget. Of course he agreed, the parts were ordered, and that's where we currently stand. Now, some of you might remember that with my own personal system, I used a cheap i3-10105F to find the root cause of my failing motherboard. Aside from the troubleshooting, that CPU no longer serves a purpose to me, so this is where we'll be putting it. With 4 cores and 8 threads that can boost up to 4.4 GHz, i3s have come a really long way in the last few years, and for the price of just $70 US at the price of purchase, makes this chip a really solid offer. For a gaming budget system, you really don't have many other options at this price point that can offer this kind of value. It is a locked chip, so no overclocking here, but with a TDP of 65 watts, cooling just isn't something we even need to think about. The motherboard of choice here will help to extend the longevity of the system going into the future. That is the B560M Steel Legend from ASRock, a micro ATX board which uses a 10-phase VRM setup with 60 amp power stages. It's nothing too crazy, honestly, but certainly more than enough for our little i3. The intention here was to give the user an upgrade path, and with Intel adding XMP support for B-series motherboards, starting with the 500 line of chipsets, makes this a great little board for the $100 I paid for it. 4 DIMM slots, VRM heatsinks, 2 M.2 slots, and support for 2nd gen LGA 1200 CPUs will open up the door for higher tier CPUs, comfortably supporting even up to an i9. On the topic of storage, I'm keeping it nice and simple with a single 1TB P3 stick from Crucial. Super reliable option with relatively quick read and write speeds for a Gen 3 drive at around 3 to 3.5 GB per second. Now, because we are using a 10th gen Comet Lake CPU on a newer B560 chipset, that does mean that we lose access to the primary M.2 slot, as the PCIe lanes are not supported with first generation LGA 1200 chips. For this reason, I recommend that if my friend ever wants to upgrade, consider jumping to the i5-11400. So for the time being, we'll just be populating one of the other locations on the board. But with 2 slots available, chucking in more storage down the road will be really easy. Then for the RAM, this is one of those parts that I had laying around. It's a 16GB kit of 3600 CO18 memory from a company called Oloy. Pretty affordable kit. I actually got this one from a friend and it's been sitting for a while. Never worked with this brand before, but enabling XMP in the BIOS, compatibility and performance shouldn't be an issue here. Next up is the power supply. I decided against getting anything used, as this is the most critical component of any system, and taking the risk of buying a unit with a faulty fan or half the cables missing or caked in dust, I'd just rather not take that chance, especially considering the user and the budget. So keeping things nice and simple here with Corsair's CX650M. 650 watts, semi-modular, and an 80 plus gold efficiency will have no problem driving the build even with future CPU and GPU swaps that demand more power. Now, as for the GPU, this is a really exciting piece of hardware, as it's a far reach back into history. This is the Gigabyte WindForce GTX 980 Ti. What was once a flagship card of the GPU market 8 years ago is now an aged piece of silicon that can be found on the used market for dirt cheap. This one I was able to find for just $85. 6GB of GDDR5 memory on a 384-bit bus with 2,814 CUDA cores. It really does feel ancient at this point when you're also considering the 250-watt TDP. But there's still plenty of life left for an entry-level system, and I think at 1080p low settings, a 144Hz gaming experience would be the goal for this little rig. And lastly, the PC case that we'll be cramming all this hardware into is one that I've had my eye on for quite some time, and that is the Core 1000 from Fractal Design. Although this case has been in production for well over a decade now, it still continues to be one of the best micro ATX cases on the market. A very straightforward design and simplistic approach to building, as Fractal is typically known for, a strong internal steel frame, full mesh front panel, optical drive bay up top, and bottom mounted fan slot make this one of the most compelling options for the price of just $50. So now that we've got a rundown of the parts, let's put this damn thing together and see how it runs. Alright, so most of the parts are inside the case now, which is great, and I think now would be a good time to just take a quick break and discuss the airflow setup for this system. So as you can probably guess, we are sticking with air cooling for this build. It is simple, reliable, and really effective. The catch here though is how you set this up. So in the Core 1000 we have 3 fan slots. A 120 can be mounted up at the front, another one on the side panel, and then up to a 92mm can be mounted at the rear. So the ideal configuration for the GPU would look something like this. A 120 up at the front, throwing air at the GPU, and another on the side exhausting that heat. Pretty effective, but what about the CPU? So in this case, cooler height clearance maxes out at 148mm, and the largest cooler that can comfortably fit in that space is this one here. This is Thermalright's Silversoul 135. It's a slim dual tower coming in at 135mm. However, because we are opting for a side-mounted 25mm thick fan, this does conflict with the overall cooler height, bringing it down to 123mm. So instead, this will have to be swapped out for the smaller Silversoul 110, which leaves a 13mm gap above the cooler, but also brings the fan size down from 120mm to 92mm, which will affect the overall cooling potential, just something to keep in mind for future CPU upgrades. We will be replacing the stock fan as well as the case fans with Noctua's Redux line, as I do have quite a few of those laying around, namely the P12 and B9 models. While the i3 does come with an included cooler in the box and admittedly will get the job done just fine, it certainly will be a lot louder and less efficient than the Silversoul. And paying the slight expense to go with a higher performing solution now might be a smart move for more powerful CPU swaps down the line. Also, there is a 2.5-inch drive sled in there, which by removing, exposes a hole that can be used to route cables through, which is what I've done in conjunction with the vertical drive mount plate to neatly hook up the GPU power cables, just something I thought I'd note. Also, you might have noticed I went the extra length to repaste the GPU die, as well as replace all of the thermal pads. For this, I've used Thermal Grizzly's Minus pad, as well as Noctua's NTH1 thermal grease. I have no clue the history of this card or when it was last serviced, so giving it some quick maintenance will certainly go a long way. So our $550 gaming build is complete, and thankfully everything went to plan. Aside from the slight inconvenience of the CPU cooler, there aren't any compatibility issues to speak of. Probably the most difficult part of this build is cable management. The unoccupied drive bay at the top does make it easy to stuff excess cables into, but there weren't any native tie-down points to also accommodate for the front panel connectors. So here I've used some 3M adhesive zip tie mounts to help tidy that up. As you could see, going with a semi-modular unit and an M.2 stick, we're able to eliminate a lot of cables that would have otherwise become clutter and obstruct airflow. So $550, how far does that get you? Well, taking a look at GPU thermals in Firmark after 1 hour, they settle into around 75 degrees C with a room ambient of 19. Full power and boost clocks here on our 980 Ti, which is great to see. Firmark is a benchmark that pushes the GPU to its absolute limit, pretty much representing worst case, and here it is getting a bit toasty, but again, that is to be expected with 250 watts flowing through it. I'm willing to bet that the maintenance we did under the hood is having a pretty significant impact on the results here as well. I've seen 980 Ti's easily hit 83 degrees C, and thankfully that's not the case here. I will also note that I'm using a program called Fan Control to control all the system's fans independently based off of what role they're meant to be serving. So for the CPU and rear fan, those will react and spin up based only off of CPU temperature. So with the fan curve set to spin at 20% until the CPU hits 50 degrees, at which point it'll top out at around 75% at 80 degrees. This same concept applies to the side fan as well, except this is set up to exhaust air purely based off of GPU temperature only. For a bit of context, this is actually something that can't be done natively within the motherboard BIOS itself, only with an external fan controller or through a third-party software like this. This program also has a very interesting feature called Mix, which I've used to set up the front fan. That is, it will spin up based off of both CPU and GPU temperatures, basically reading whichever one is running the hottest and reacting off of that. Given that the CPU and GPU will never fully be utilized at the same time, this seems like the most appropriate way of setting these up. Now switching over to gaming, I had time to test out 4 games at 1080p low to medium settings. So starting off with Palia, an open world MMO game similar to Animal Crossing, while doing odd tasks and strolling around the main village of Kalima, there are some spikes and hiccups but still a very playable experience. This isn't a game that needs to be ran at super high frame rates, so I've locked it to 60, and it consistently saturates that target. Moving on to Apex, this is actually one that surprised me, as this game tends to be pretty demanding, but while rotating through the map and engaging in gunfights, we still see 100 to 120 FPS consistently. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about Fortnite. Due to how unoptimized this game is, along with the amount of game logic and NPCs, frame rate absolutely tanks. I also tested in Team Rumble, which is a harder to run game mode, as each place building by all players is an entity that needs to be calculated and rendered. With 32 players all building in close relation to each other, that's a lot of information that needs to be processed. With that in mind, I probably wouldn't recommend this game for this system. The experience is just way too variable. Now, Lego Fortnite is something that has picked up a lot of traction recently, so I wanted to try that out. And yeah, this is very enjoyable to play and chill out to. Some tweaking of the settings strikes a nice balance between visual fidelity and frame rate. And finally, some Minecraft. This is a game that my friend did say he'd be playing pretty regularly. Now, although vanilla Minecraft can run on just about anything, I decided to additionally test out a Silder's Vibrant Shader pack that I have, just to see how bad it takes performance, and thankfully, it's not as bad as I expected. Roaming around my base area, we still see frames consistently around 60 FPS, so if this is a configuration that my friend would like to play with, it certainly is viable. So overall, this system is very pleasing. For a rig of this price point, it does have its limitations, but again, the whole idea here is to get my friend an upgrade path to higher end hardware as their needs for more performance increases. For now though, this will be plenty for what he wants to do with it, and all the testing here kind of serves as a best case scenario, just to see how far we can really stretch this older generation hardware. But yeah, that's about it. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.